Hello, I'm Bill Serban, and this is an episode from the Cognitive Challenges of Effective Teaching video series produced by my colleague Steve Chu and me. This segment focuses on ineffective learning strategies and explores how and why students use ineffective strategies and what teachers can do to engage them in using more effective strategies. In this classroom scene, the teacher suggests that students start to prepare for their next exam. This prompts students to think about how they will study for the test. One student plans to retype lecture notes and then read them over and over. A second student plans to study and then self-test over the material in a way similar to the actual course exam. A third student plans to block out a whole day to study for the exam. And a fourth student plans to focus on the examples from class and then generate some of his own. These depict common differences among students in terms of the strategies they use to learn in their classes. And these differences have important consequences for their learning. A significant cognitive challenge for teaching is that students underperform and learn less when they use ineffective learning strategies or use strategies ineffectively. This challenge includes several dimensions. Research indicates that college students vary in their knowledge and use of learning strategies. Studies have found that students, 1, often use ineffective learning strategies such as rereading, highlighting, underlining, and cramming. They also tend to underuse some particularly effective strategies such as self-testing. Sometimes students use effective strategies incorrectly. For example, self-testing can be very effective, but students may stop studying prematurely after getting a question correct one time. And fourth, sometimes students intend to use effective strategies and then don't. They might plan to space their study out over several days, but instead study in one long cram session before a test. Before moving on, I want to clarify this distinction between effective and ineffective learning strategies. This table contains a few well-known and well-researched learning strategies. Based on extensive research, we're able to categorize these as ineffective or effective. As you can see, the less effective strategies include things like highlighting, underlining, cramming, and rereading. More effective strategies go by labels such as retrieval practice, space practice, explanation, and elaboration. Basically, the distinction between effective and ineffective means that students learn more with effective strategies. And in head-to-head comparisons, students using effective strategies outperform students using ineffective strategies. To illustrate these, let's consider a few examples. In this study, researchers compared 4 learning methods. In the learning phase, students studied an article from Scientific American and then took a test 1 week later. The learning methods were, in Group 1, students read the article 1 time. That's the study group. Second group, the repeated study group, reread the article up to 4 times. Third, the concept mapping group read the article and made a concept map of the content. And fourth, a retrieval practice group read the article and then wrote down everything they could remember without looking back at the article. So, these students participated in one of the learning methods and then took a test on the article 1 week later. Here are the results. Graph A shows the test scores for the 4 groups on verbatim or factual questions. These are simply questions that students could answer by remembering information that was explicitly stated in the article. As you can see from left to right, you see the different learning methods. First, the red bar is the study group, which read 1 time. The yellow bar is the repeated study group, which read up to 4 times. The blue bar is the concept mapping group that read the material and made a concept map. And the fourth, the green bar, is the retrieval practice group, which read the material and then tried to remember everything they could about the article. Very clearly, you can see that the retrieval practice group far outperformed the other methods. On average, the retrieval practice group scored around 70%, compared with between upper 20s to upper 50% in the other groups. Graph B shows the test scores for the 4 groups on inference questions. These are questions that students had to use inferences in order to answer correctly. The results are similar to the verbatim questions, with the retrieval practice group outperforming the other methods. Here's a second example. These are results from a study that compared test performance of students who studied in one session, that's called massed practice, versus spaced practice. In this case, all the students studied the material 8 times. They were learning synonyms for very unfamiliar terminology, the kind of terminology you might see on a graduate record exam. So all the students were getting these lists, which they studied 8 times. The first 4 bars in this graph, from left to right, represent students who study the material in one session, either 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, or 1 day prior to the test. The bar on the far right represents a spaced practice group that studied the material each of the 4 days before the test. Even though students all studied the same amount in the same amount of time, the students who spread out their study over the 4 days scored much higher on the test. These 2 studies illustrate the kind of research that helps us to determine the relative effectiveness of different learning strategies. These are common findings that some strategies are consistently better than others. It also raises the question, why don't students use more effective strategies when clearly some are better than others? We know there are at least 5 major reasons why students don't use effective learning strategies. First, and maybe foremost, they've not been taught or exposed to effective learning strategies. Survey studies have found that a large majority of students, anywhere from 64% to 80% of students, report that they have not been taught how to study by their teachers in school. So it's not part of the formal curriculum, and this probably means that students very much are left to their own devices to figure out how to study on their own. Second, students often believe their strategies are effective, or at least adequate for their purposes. For example, students who participated in the study comparing retrieval practice to rereading and concept mapping predicted that rereading would be very effective and that retrieval practice would be the least effective strategy, when, in fact, retrieval practice was actually the most effective strategy. A third reason is that students are not aware of how to use strategies effectively. They may not be aware of when and how to use specific strategies optimally. For example, many students use flashcards, which can be an effective way to self-test. But students may use flashcards ineffectively by dropping cards from study prematurely and not retesting themselves in future study sessions. A fourth reason is it's difficult for students to change study habits and routines that have been established over a long period of time. Even when they become aware of better strategies, students may not be able to adopt them consistently. And a fifth reason is that students have a lot of misconceptions about learning. Here's one example. Students tend to equate the ability to remember material at the moment of study with being able to know the material on a future test. So, for example, they tend to use strategies like rereading that produce a quick sense of knowing at the time of studying, but then fail to recognize they may not know the material several days later on a test. Given the gaps in student knowledge about learning and their well-established study habits, what can teachers do to promote the use of better learning strategies? Here are some recommendations about how to enhance students' learning strategies. Essentially, teachers have 2 basic options to help students use more effective learning strategies. One is to incorporate learning strategies into your course, and a second is to teach students how to use learning strategies appropriate to the course and subject matter. Let's take each separately. Option 1, incorporating learning strategies into your course. There are numerous ways to engage students in effective learning processes in a course. The following examples have a good research track record. When done appropriately, they can have a positive effect on student learning. So here are 3 examples. Use practice quizzes. One approach is to use frequent low-stakes practice quizzes to engage students in self-testing and retrieval practice. Practice quizzes can be done at the start or end of class or online before or after class. A second strategy is spaced practice. Teachers can schedule study sessions on a spaced practice schedule. As part of the course, students study the material several times, separated by lag time well before each course exam. These sessions could be carried out online or even short sessions in class. And third, use self-explanation and elaboration. A basic format for self-explanation is to create brief interactive episodes in which students explain course concepts to one another, followed by instructor feedback. For example, teachers could use a technique such as think, pair, share several times during a class period to promote self-explanation of key concepts. Regardless of the strategies you decide to incorporate in your class, however, we recommend that you also explain how and why they enhance learning. Using effective strategies as part of the course is an opportunity for students to better understand, and potentially it may prime them to adopt the strategies in their independent study. Option 2 is to teach students how to use effective learning strategies in your course. Because students have little formal instruction in how to learn, we recommend teaching them how to use learning strategies best suited to your course and subject matter. However, this is a major undertaking and really well beyond the scope of this video. However, a step in this direction of teaching students to use effective learning strategies is to help students use their current strategies more effectively. In this case, students use a number of strategies which may be relatively ineffective, and with a few modifications they could be more effective. Here are 2 examples. Students reread a lot, and rereading is relatively ineffective. But to make it more effective, students should allow lag time between readings and also engage in self-testing between readings. So instead of reading the material and then rereading it immediately, you recommend to students read the material, then let it sit. Wait a few hours or a day, and then just before rereading it, try to remember everything that you read the first time, and then reread the material. A second example is flashcards. Students use flashcards a lot, and these can be a good way for students to test themselves. But students often undermine this strategy by just reviewing the answers and not really testing themselves. So what you want to be able to do is to point out to students how to use flashcards most effectively. That is, keep the cards in the deck, repeatedly test yourself on the same questions even after you've gotten them correct. In both cases, this kind of advice may help students start to use their ineffective strategies more effectively. Here are some resources with more information about effective and ineffective learning strategies. The first 2 are links to my website, Taking Learning Seriously, where you can find guidelines and tip sheets for both instructors and students about how to use learning strategies. The third item is an excellent video series created by Steve Chu titled How to Get the Most Out of Studying, and I would recommend this for both students as well as instructors. And the fourth resource discusses how to help students learn more from relatively ineffective strategies. It's called Enhance Ineffective Learning Strategies. Finally, we hope you have an opportunity to explore learning strategies with colleagues. And if so, here are a few discussion questions to help you get started. Thanks for your attention, and we also hope you'll view the other videos in the series.